Joe Vitale is the Dean of Studies at the Zacharias Institute and an itinerant speaker for RZIM. During her years in Oxford, Joe completed a Master of Studies in Biblical Interpretation and a PhD in Old Testament Studies, both at the University of Oxford. With her background in biblical studies, Joe has a particular passion for speaking on questions of biblical reliability, challenges to the character of God, and the uniqueness of Jesus Christ in a world of competing truth claims. Please welcome Joe Vitale.
Well, good evening. It is so good to be here with you this weekend. And for those of you who weren't expecting the British accent to be coming out of my mouth, I hope you have an easier time understanding me than when I first met my Italian-American in-laws in New Jersey. I'd been chatting away to my husband's great Uncle Big, and yes, he really is called Uncle Big, for about half an hour before he finally cut me off and said, "Doll, everything you say sounds so beautiful, but I can't understand a word of it." Hopefully that's not going to be the case tonight. You know, the last time that I was here in California was actually 1 year ago, when along with my colleague Cameron McAllister and some other members of the RZIM team, we were taking part in a week of outreach events at UC Berkeley. Now, of all the universities that I've spent some time on, I have to say that I've never been anywhere else quite like Berkeley. It was just a campus that was filled with so many different kinds of people and so many competing worldviews, all kind of jostling together in this chaotic and colorful circus. And on the one hand, I found that you couldn't walk down a street without tripping over a New Age store and being invited in for a psychic reading. And yet every other student that I met on that campus was a science major who seemed to be firmly entrenched in a naturalistic worldview. And it just so happened, actually, that that week at Berkeley coincided with International Women's Day. Now, as you can imagine, in the birthplace of the free speech movement, International Women's Day is pretty crazy on Berkeley's campus. All day there were women out in the streets, and they were marching and protesting, that they were yelling and waving signs. And to be honest, there was a lot of anger on the campus, but yet just beneath that anger, you could kind of feel that actually there was a really deep well of hurt and pain. And then right in the middle of this kind of crazy scene on Berkeley's campus, there was a girl standing on the busiest thoroughfare of the university, and she was wearing fishnet tights, and she had a short denim skirt on, and she was topless, and then she just had a paper bag over her head with only the eyes cut out. And you could tell that people didn't really know what to make of this public spectacle. Some people would, I guess out of shock, they would laugh at her. And then other people just seemed to feel deeply uncomfortable, and so they just kind of turned their eyes down and they really quickly hurried on. But if you got close enough to this girl, if you actually approached her, then you could see these words written across the top of that paper bag. "All 5 of my rapists are getting away with it." And then you looked into her eyes, and they were just completely haunted. I'm going to call this girl Sophie for the sake of privacy this evening. But you know, as I stood there looking at Sophie, to be honest, with my own heart breaking, I found myself wondering what Jesus Christ would have to say to her. Os Guinness has dubbed the time that we're living in now the grand age of apologetics, a technological and global era in which for the Christian, there's just no escaping the challenge of pluralism, because every question and every questioner has landed on our doorstep or on our Twitter feed, if you like, and they're demanding our attention. In such a culture of confusion, I think it can be easy to feel paralyzed by the sheer range of beliefs and choices that are in front of us. You know, looking at the women on campus that day at Berkeley, with nothing but a Bible in my hands, I will admit that I certainly felt woefully inadequate in terms of knowing how to respond to their needs. And yet, I am hardly the first Christian to find myself standing in a marketplace of ideas feeling like I'm drowning in all the noise and confusion around me. In fact, it was around 2,000 years ago that the Apostle Paul first set foot in the city of Athens and found himself in a remarkably similar context, an event which Luke, the author of the New Testament book of Acts, records in some detail in Acts chapter 17. Now, while the Athens that Paul visited may have been past its heyday as the thought leader of the civilized world, nevertheless, that city remained a cultural powerhouse. And there were two rival philosophies that dominated the city at that time. There were the Stoics and there were the Epicureans. Now, the Stoics held to a pantheistic belief which led them to conflate the idea of God with a kind of world soul, emphasizing fate and the importance of being in harmony with nature. Whereas the Epicureans held to a deistic belief which led them to basically view the world as due to chance, just a random happenstance of atoms with no notion of survival beyond the grave. You know, I just find it remarkable that 2,000 years on, we can find the modern descendants of those two competing philosophies, the New Age and naturalism, still existing today on the very same campus. Athens was also a city that Luke describes as swamped by idols. Athena, Apollo, Jupiter, Venus, Mercury, Bacchus, Neptune, Diana, all the gods of Olympus were gathered there. And this was a city where anything would go, where all beliefs were welcome and all truth claims were tolerated, except, of course, for the claim that your belief was actually true. And if ever there was a contender for that grand title of the grand age of apologetics, then surely it was this first century world that Jesus stepped into. And yet somehow the first followers of Christ not only found a foothold in that culture, but Christianity spread so rapidly across the ancient world that within 4 centuries it was adopted as the official religion of the Roman Empire. Consequently, if we want to learn how to persuasively engage with our culture today, might I suggest that what better way is there than to learn from those who have gone before us, and particularly this remarkable account of Paul that's preserved for us in Acts 17. You know, what immediately stands out to me about the description of Paul's entry into Athens is that 3 times we're told that Paul looked around or considered the idols. And in our culture today, where the popular perception of Christianity is only becoming increasingly negative, I think as Christians it can be really tempting for us to want to retreat from the world, to kind of hide ourselves away in our safe spaces and echo chambers. And yet the Apostle Paul understood that if he wanted to engage his culture, then first he needed to see his culture. That before speaking, he had to learn to really listen. Which is why he not only spent time witnessing in the synagogue on the Sabbath, as was his custom, but Paul also deliberately left his cultural comfort zone and went and engaged in the marketplace day after day to hear the hottest philosophies of the day presented and debated. What about us today? What is it that we're seeing, and who are we listening to? When was the last time that you followed somebody on Twitter that you disagree with, or watched a TED Talk, or heard a lecture by someone that actually has a polar opposite view to the one that you hold? Or maybe when was the last time that you sat down with an atheist friend and asked her, what is it about Christianity that she finds the most off-putting, and instead of being quick to respond, you just sat there and really listened? Like Paul, we need to learn to first see our culture. But once Paul had seen the culture, the text tells us that he was greatly distressed to see the city was submerged with idols. Now, importantly, this verb here that describes Paul's reaction to the idols is the same word that's used several times in the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, to describe God's own response to idolatry. It's often translated in our Bibles as being provoked to anger or grief. You see, here we see Paul's heart mirroring God's own heart. He too is so outraged that the idols that have been set up are taking the place of the one true God. And what does that visceral reaction of Paul's tell us about Paul? Well, it tells us that he really loved God. because it's the nature of love to be zealous for the praise of the one that you love. And if you don't believe me, then just spend time with parents of a newborn child, and after being shown like the 50th photo of their child drooling from every conceivable angle, you will start to get what I mean. But if we feel that way about drooling infants who we have made, then how much more should we feel that way about God? How much should we desire the praise of the one who made us? There may be all sorts of reasons why you came here this weekend and why you're interested in apologetics. And one very good reason might be because you're motivated by love for those who don't yet know God. And yet, I want to suggest to you tonight that actually the primary motivation driving our apologetics should be love for God. In the words of the Apostle Peter in 1 Peter 3:15, before we prepare to give an answer, we first must set apart Christ as Lord in our hearts. Without loving God, our interest in apologetics will either very quickly wane, or it will become just a personal hobby to indulge in because we just really love having a good argument and being shown to be right. On the other hand, however, in the words of the great 18th century evangelist John Wesley, if you set a man on fire with love for God, then people will come for miles to watch him burn. Or as one of my Middle Eastern RZIM colleagues puts it, we need that fire in the belly. Only God's love has sustaining power to keep us impassioned for the right reasons, that the world might know that he alone is not just the reason for our hope, but for all hope. It's Paul's love for God that drives him to keep going back to that marketplace day after day after day, until at last he began receiving so much attention on account of his strange message, they called him a babbler, and his unconventional beliefs, they accused him of preaching foreign gods, that he's summoned to give a defense for his belief, an apologetic, at the Areopagus. Now, Areopagus literally means the hill of Mars, and it's referred to what used to be the most venerated judicial court in ancient Greece. And actually, even in Paul's day, it remained the place where the city council would gather together to debate morality, education, and religion. And what stands out most about Paul's apologetic before the Areopagus is this, that he doesn't begin by drawing battle lines. Instead, he looks to establish common ground. We see Peter doing exactly the same thing in his sermon at Pentecost in Acts 2, where he engaged his primarily Jewish audience by drawing on their commonly held beliefs in messianic prophecy and by appealing to the authority that they all already recognize, the Jewish scriptures. We see Paul doing the same thing actually earlier in this chapter when he's addressing the Thessalonian and Berean Jews. And yet here, at the Areopagus, Paul is aware that beginning with an appeal to Scripture won't have persuasive power for his audience because his Scriptures were not an authority to the Athenians. Perhaps some of you have discovered this same thing for yourselves in conversations with friends when they ask you, why do you believe the things that you do? And you've simply responded, because the Bible tells me so. Personally, I found that conversation goes about as well as when my mum asks me why I did something really stupid, and I reply that my friend Susie told me to which my mum immediately responds, if Susie told you to jump off a bridge, would you do that too? Rather than beginning with his own tradition, therefore, Paul looks for the common ground that he can affirm about their culture, and then he builds a bridge to his own beliefs. In the words of Paul in verse 22, people of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. So you are ignorant of the very thing that you worship, and this is what I am going to proclaim to you. Later in his speech, Paul continues to build those bridges by twice quoting the Athenians' own authorities, their Greek poets, to describe his own Christian God, as he says, for in him we live and move and have our being. Or yet again, as some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. In our cities today, where civil discourse is a dying art and where culture wars are raging, we too need to find ways to build bridges and establish common ground. That day on Berkeley's campus at the Women's March, it dawned on me that actually for all of our differences, there was a great deal that I could actually affirm that day to these women. For example, I could affirm that those protesters that day were right to believe that women are of immense value. And I could also stand with Sophie in full solidarity and agreement that actually what had been done to her was no small matter, but it was objectively evil, and that she was absolutely right to cry out for justice. And yet, our conversations don't stop at our agreement. Because once Paul has found a bridge between worldviews, in this case, that altar to an unknown God, he's then in a position to set Christianity alongside the other worldviews and to lead his hearers over that bridge so that they can see things from his perspective. Now, Paul's effectiveness in doing this rests on the fact that he truly understood his hearers because he'd taken that time to thoroughly get to know how they saw the world. And so he's able to set Christianity apart from both the Stoic belief in a pantheistic God on the one hand and the Epicurean belief in a deistic God and the universe of randomness on the other. And instead, Paul presents them with a third option, Christianity, that there is a creator God who is both transcendent and personal in nature. As he says in Acts 17, verse 24, the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by human hands. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he's not far from any one of us. Likewise, that week at Berkeley was filled with conversations that, because they began with common ground, led to genuine dialogue. For example, while I agreed with those students that women did have great value, I also found myself able to ask them how they could account for human worth from a purely naturalistic perspective. After all of our lives are just cosmic accidents lived in a universe of blind, pitiless indifference, to borrow a phrase from Richard Dawkins, then on what basis do we assign any value or significance to another person? We talk about human rights, but what are these rights grounded on? And if we're just dancing to our DNA and the name of the game is survival, then why shouldn't we say that one life is of greater value than another, or that might makes right, or that it's every man for himself? From a Christian perspective, however, I could account for why I believe human life is so very precious, because like Paul, I believe in a transcendent, personal creator God who created humankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. According to Christianity, you are not random, you are made. You're no accident, you are intentioned. And not just made by God, but made like God, made in his image. A bold declaration that man and woman alike are God's masterpiece, which makes sense of why we so instinctively grieve what happened to Sophie at Berkeley, because what took place was a violation of the most sacred thing in the entire world, a human being. And yet at the same time, if Christianity's perspective on human worth is true, then that also means that no matter what happens, nothing can strip Sophie of her dignity or make her less than. Her worth will never be defined either by anything that she's done or anything that could be done to her, but simply because she is created in the image of God and is fiercely loved by him. Likewise, while I admired the commitment of the students on Berkeley's campus to social justice, that commitment also jarred with their naturalistic assumptions that the laws that govern the universe are solely physical rather than moral in nature. Consequently, my question to most of those Berkeley students that I met and who didn't believe in objective morality was this: if there is no such thing as right or wrong, then why do you care so much about setting to right the world's wrongs? And this cultural incoherence is actually harrowingly expressed by the poet Steve Turner in his short poem entitled The Conclusion. And this is what Turner writes: "My love, She said that when all's considered, we're only machines. So I chained her to my bedroom wall for future use, and she cried. From the Christian perspective, however, it makes sense that we would feel such absolute and unrelenting opposition to what happened to Sophie, because if a moral lawgiver, God, exists, then our outrage is not just arbitrary, but it aligns with a true reality that right and wrong exist and that evil is very, very real, and that what happened to Sophie was exactly that. It was evil. Like the Apostle Paul, we need to help people to see their beliefs in a different light by setting them alongside Christianity, because only then will they be better positioned to be able to watch their idols fall. And so Paul presses on in his speech, stating in verse 29, "Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill." Now, Paul's argument here is simple but compelling, that if we're God's offspring, then as the one who made us, God is surely greater than his creation, in the same way that we too are surely greater than anything that our hands have made. So why then do we worship idols who by their very nature are less than ourselves, let alone God? In short, Paul is making the case that God is better than their idols. And that's as true today as it was then. And one of the idols that I saw most clearly on display at Berkeley was the idol of humanism, the myth of human progress, the idea that humanity really can be the solution to its own problem, that we can fix ourselves by the work of our own hands. We just need to behave better and be more reasonable in the future than we have been in the past. And yet, while I deeply respect the longing for justice that so many of those protesters displayed on International Women's Day, at the same time, I couldn't help but feel a kind of sadness. Because at the end of the day, all it took was one look at Sophie to realize that whatever progress we might make as human beings, it would never be enough. Never enough, because our issues go so much deeper than any legal or political or social remedy can fix, running all the way down to the problem that Jesus himself identifies, that the heart of the problem is the problem of the human heart. In the words of the Russian author Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who spent 8 years in a Soviet labor camp, if only it were all so simple, if only there were evil people somewhere committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them off from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human person. And who's willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? This is the very same challenge that we find at the heart of Paul's message to the Areopagus, that you cannot solve your own problems. You cannot create God with your own hands and then expect him to save you. Only the living God can do that. And so Paul's message culminates with these bold words. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. Now, Paul's hearers might not be able to come up with a philosophy that provides an adequate solution to humanity's problems, but Paul assures them not only that God can and will, but actually that in Jesus Christ, the man he has appointed, God already has. He's done it. And the proof of that is in the historical resurrection. And it may be 2,000 years later, but what hope that good news still holds for us today, especially to those who have been the victims of serious injustice, those like Sophie, who's left devastated while all 5 of her rapists are getting away with it. To be able to offer Sophie the hope that even though human justice had failed her, divine justice will not, because there's a God whose unshakable commitment to both love and justice run all the way from the Old to the New Testament, culminating at the cross, that from the beginning to the end, the judge of all the earth will do what is right. And yet at the very same time, we can also find hope in the reality that no matter how defaced or dehumanized we've been made to feel, no matter what kind of bag or mask all of us might wear over our heads, there is a God who sees right to the heart of us. A God who looked on Sophie with such compassion in her harassed and helpless state that he willingly chose to come and live a human life and suffer alongside of her, to be stripped naked and exposed like her, to undergo public humiliation and ridicule like her, to become one from whom men hide their faces, to experience what it's like to wear nothing but shame and to endure unimaginable violence, isolation, and suffering, all because he couldn't bear to stand by and watch from some far-off heavenly throne. Instead, out of love, he came to suffer with her and for her, and in dying in her place, he rescued her not only from the guilt of everything she's ever done, but to free her from the shame of everything that has ever been done to her, and to give her new life that is signified by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Amen. You know, that day in Berkeley, as soon as she laid eyes on Sophie, one of my colleagues with Os Guinness, someone called Madeline Jackson, she actually had the overwhelming feeling of God saying to her in that moment, out of everybody here on this campus today, I identify with her. I'm here for her. And so Madeline actually went over to Sophie and she began to share with her some of the things that I've been talking you through tonight. And you know, as she did so, Sophie just began to weep. And she wept, and then she threw her arms around Madeline, and she hung onto her so tightly, and the two of them just stood there in the middle of that square at Berkeley, just crying together. And then Madeline asked if she could pray for Sophie, and Sophie said yes. And so they stood there together, holding hands in the middle of that square at Berkeley with all sorts of onlookers walking past and wondering what on earth is going on as they stood there holding hands in the middle of the square and praying to the living God. And you know, that was the day that Sophie discovered for the first time that there is a living God, who a God not made by human hands, but the God who is the Lord of heaven and earth. And you know, that day back at the Areopagus was also a day where some heard Paul's message as very good news. And so we're told in verse 32, when they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, we want to hear you again on this subject. And at that, Paul left the council. Some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. Which brings us to my closing point for this evening, which is that the best apologetics lead to evangelism. You may have heard it said that apologetics is all about showing the plausibility of the Christian faith, and certainly that is a huge part of it, whereas evangelism is about securing a commitment to the Christian faith. Or maybe you've heard people say, well, apologetics is conversational, whereas evangelism is invitational. And yet when we see the way that the apostles did apologetics, we realize that actually this line between apologetics and evangelism was frequently blurred, that they understood the task of apologetics as leading to evangelism. It's about removing the debris or the obstacles along the way so that people have a path cleared for the coming of Jesus Christ. You know, this weekend we're going to be immersed in so much rich and insightful apologetics training, and I'm so excited to hear from the amazing lineup of speakers who are coming. And yet my question for all of us is this: what are we going to do with all this training? Because of course, learning about God and loving him with our minds is always a beautiful act of worship, and that's what this weekend is. This is an act of worship. But it would be such a shame if what happens at the conference stays at the conference. How are we going to take this teaching out into the world? Now, I'll admit that at the beginning of 2018, this year, I found myself feeling really weary. And so I took a day out to reflect and to pray about why I was just feeling a little bit discouraged. And as I did so, I realized it was because I sort of felt like I got into a rut where I was spending so much of my time doing apologetics on the back foot. I felt like I was forever defending, but never advancing. And so as I came into this year, I began just to pray this prayer every morning. Lord, I don't want to spend all my time putting out fires. I want to start them. I don't want to spend my days as a Christian just kind of running around doing PR damage control. I want to introduce people to Jesus Christ and watch as their lives are lit up by the fire of love for God. And Paul told those Athenians, he said to them that God is not far from every one of them. Maybe there are even some of you here tonight that God is not far from, and perhaps he's reaching out. But I think the question for all of us here is this: do we really believe that? Do we really believe that God is not far from everyone? Because I think if we did, that would completely change the way that we approached our conversations. And if that is something that you believe or you'd like to believe, I'd like to pray, Lord, help my unbelief, then I invite you to join me this weekend in making that commitment to become one of those who doesn't just spend their time putting out fires, but who is really excited to start them. Amen? Amen.